not every season starts off well.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are early season disappointments. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a hope giver when things don't start well.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm gonna answer you, and I'm gonna respond mostly from experience of what we've learned. And then I think the cool part of that is that we're now figuring out that there are some reasons that it works and the things that don't work. And you're able to tell me that. And now maybe we can help others replicate it a little bit. So one of the things I learned, let's talk about staff first. What I had to deal with as a coach is you've got to deal with your staff, and then you also have to deal with the players that you're blessed with, the team. And they're different, but in some ways they're the same. And so preseason, it was important for me to go through with our staff, how are we going to respond after a win in game one or a loss in game one?
So you actually talked about both scenarios.
100%.
Okay.
And even to the point of, all right, how are we going to deal with it if we're 0-3? Because we've got a tough schedule in front of us. None of us want that to happen.
And some coaches won't even talk about that as a possibility,
Right.
Like negative energy or something.
And I understand that because you don't want to speak it into existence, some people will say. But the other part of that is if we don't already have an idea of how to handle adversity, then it's going to be a lot harder to deal with on the spur of the moment. If we wake up one day and all of a sudden we're 0-3 or 0-5 or we can't get things going, it might have helped that I can bring us back to, hey, remember we talked about that if things don't go well, that this is what we have to hang our hat on. We're going to come back to the process. We're going to come back to the purpose. We're not going to make our living and dying athletically to hang on one game or one performance.
Okay, so let me pull on that for a second.
Yep.
What you're talking about is developing a regulation strategy when you're regulated. It's a lot easier to come up with a plan for how to deal with 0-3 when you're 0-0
Yes.
than it is when you're 0-3.
I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a little boy. But what I would tell you is I was fascinated with space. I was fascinated with, NASA and all the things they did. Well, they used to have a discussion, and this is kind of what you're talking about, that they had a black book, so to speak. How will we deal with the scenario that we don't want to have to deal with, but we have a scenario where we've got a man in a space and the ship is having troubles. We want to make those decisions ahead of time before we get the emotion in of all the factors that jump in. So as much as we can deal with it ahead of time, it doesn't solve every problem.
No.
But
what you're doing is you're thinking with your smart part of your brain instead of the reactive part when you're 0-3.
Correct.
Right.
And that's what I get fascinated by these discussions because I've learned that it works, but I didn't know that it worked because the rest of my brain shut down. Yeah. And I didn't know that. And so by being ahead of it, and understanding that we can make some of those decisions. So similarly, I would not have the exact same discussions with players, but we would couch it in a similar way, is that we didn't put the first game of the year, or the first scrimmage, or the first practice. This is not the win all, be all, and all, goal of the deal. Because what we want to do is to become consistent in our performance to see good things that happen. We talk about going 1-0. What does that mean from a simplicity standpoint is let's figure out how to make the next best decision to move forward. And it's 1-0, not in the game. We're talking about in our decisions weekly in how we practice, how we go to school, how we work in English class, how we deal with our mom and dad. You're going to tell me why all that kind of works.
Yeah, so back up one more step. Before you can communicate to your staff that truth or to your players, you have to decide what regulates you. You have to find your own regulation strategies, because if you don't know what lets you think well, and what you do when you start to feel that pressure, how do you handle adversity yourself and have a way of dealing intentionally with that, then you're not going to be able to pass that on.
Yeah.
And we know that the brain is made to operate together. So if I'm around people that are positive, then that's going to communicate. If I'm around people that are negative, that's going to communicate. And most often, the contagion flows from the top down.
Yes.
And so if you walk in the room 0-3 and you don't have a plan,
Yeah.
then we're all in trouble.
That's exactly right.
But if you do, all of a sudden now you're a hope giver. You're
Right.
passing that hope on to your.
And so we've had that happen recently, in a couple of seasons ago. Things were not going well early in the year. We had a loss at Mustang that was, I think, had made us 1-4 or 1-5, something like that. And it was a dark time in the staff room and the locker room and all that. Again, we were going to say these things differently, but I used to listen to Pat Jones sometimes, and he would talk in his phrase of how you have to self-hypnotize.
Mm-hmm.
You have to first convince yourself before you can do anything else. And so I remember vividly that Sunday afternoon going into our staff meeting for the week and having a plan for myself, first of all, to be a hope giver, because I know that the way the staff is going to respond is going to be a direct correlation to what I bring to them. And if I'm going to be that guy that is spiraling and the season is lost, and they're going to feel that way, and then consequently the players are going to feel that way. And so it doesn't mean that I have the magic of being able to get the players immediately to feel like I do, but the best chance we have is if we can trickle that down.
Yeah.
For me to model that I'm not panicked, that I'm not happy, but I've got a plan.
Yeah, we call it the contagion of calm.
And I will tell you, that's a big deal.
Yeah. And so you'll have a player that pulls on it, gets a hold of it, and then another one,
Yes.
and another one. The research shows that if we are giving hope, if our players have hope, their ability for their brain to function is at a much higher level than if they feel that hope closed off. Then they're in more of a survival mode, and survival mode doesn't let the cortex, the smart part of our brain, operate at nearly as good a capacity.
Well, a quick anecdote from my own coaching when I was younger. I have a personality. You have we all have different personalities that we have to operate within. But I learned this pretty good. I'm pretty analytical when it comes to calling plays and leading a team and knowing how to help win. It was pretty early in my career, and I was upset with the officials, and I began getting really vocal with the officials and really arguing the point. And I got angry. I was taught as a player not to be that way. I was a quarterback, and so you didn't play emotionally. And so here I am coaching emotionally, and the thing that I came away that day when I really looked at it is I hurt my team, because when I got emotional like that, I could not be analytical. I could not make the calls correctly. I could not be my best version of myself. So now I'm contagiously poor to everybody else. And so for me, that helped me to learn I don't want to be that guy. And so it gave me reasons to want to look for the tools to be able to have that calmness.
Right. And we understand that our staffs need coaches with emotion.
Right.
But that emotion, again, I would argue, functions best with intentionality.
Yes.
So if that is emotion that's just reacting to the environment, then it's going to tend to be not well thought out, and it may hit the point once in a while, but it may completely miss and cause players to spiral. But if your emotions are intentional, like, okay, this is a time where we want a coach to rally and push our players, or to get on them a little bit, but it's got intentionality to it, then it's a thought through, and we're getting the most out of our brain and ultimately our staff and then our players.
I think so too. I would tell you that our dad, who we both believe was a pretty dang good coach, was a lot more emotional than I was, a little more like you have been as a coach. But he would say to us, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but I believe it, maybe because it's dad, but he said he never got a technical as a basketball coach that he didn't intend to get. And so I think we're not saying don't be passionate, don't be who you are, don't be, don't do all that. But you do need to have a strategy for why we're doing something and how we're leading. And how I would do it, Joe, is I made sure the players knew that it was my job to work for them, but not them. Because I think the minute we start losing it, we give the players an excuse to lose it and to make that a reason for us not to win.
That's good. That's good.